There are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one?
If this happened, it's game over.
It's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed?
This is a fantastic interview by Piers Morgan, and he packs in some of the most relevant questions that people have about Christianity. I love it when people know how to give concise, informed answers that stay on subject to questions like this. Now, Wes Huff does all three of those things. Now, there's one answer in particular he gives to a very common question and objection that I've heard in culture many times that I didn't really hear before, and it's perfect, and we can learn a lot. Before I let you see that, I want to introduce you to my friend Braxton Hunter, who is part of One Life Network, and he is an apologist much like Wes Huff and has encountered these kinds of questions before. So we need kind of a running insight into what it looks like to sit in Wes Huff's seat.
All right. Well, thanks, Brett. I'm certainly glad to try.
Well, all right. Here we go. Rapid fire questions from Piers
Interesting
Morgan.
about your perspective on this from your history and your studying is that you believe a lot of the New Testament is unarguably factually true.
I do, yeah. And I think that that's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Jesus Christ actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection. And then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See that?
He got that from Alex O'Connor, I think.
I think so, yeah. I was just thinking that.
So when you're out in these kind of settings, and Braxton's done that before, is that a fairly common thought that people have that, Jesus probably didn't exist or he was made up or mythological? Do you run into that much?
Not really, but where you're going to run into it is among everyday people who are not really plugged into this ongoing discussion about historical Jesus and what's really going on with all of that, because a good friend of mine, Mike Licona, who is a historian and a New Testament scholar, he is plugged in. He's having a debate with Bart Ehrman, who's the leading voice from the other side in New Testament scholarship, the agnostic, atheist type side. And both of those men will tell you that no, the academy is very much, yes, there was a Jesus. There's a video of Bart Ehrman, again, not a friend of Christianity, a critic of Christianity, who says, yeah, you people out there who want to say that Jesus never existed, the mythicists, Jesus mythicists, he says, you have your own little conclaves and people believe that, but in the scholarship, it's just, there's nothing. It's just not. It's ridiculous. No, there was a Jesus, and one of the reasons that gives us reason to believe that is the greatest historian of ancient Rome, Cornelius Tacitus, talks about Jesus and talks about his death. There are a lot of sources that may or probably are talking about Jesus. You can get all of those in a great book called Jesus Outside the New Testament by Van Voorst. But I would just encourage people that is something you'll hear on the street or from internet atheists. But it's not something you're going to hear from the people on either side of this debate who are working on this.
Yeah, so Huff isn't just being like Jesus fanboy on the news and shooting things out. That's something that's seen inside the scholarship.
And that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity, because obviously if he was, then that is a miracle. And then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it? So it's at the crux of it. From the text of the New Testament then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who is said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. What we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And this happened over the course of, as Luke in his combination, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, says over the course of 40 days. This wasn't a short event. And so there were as many as, Paul says, up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event before his ultimate, resurrecting, going to the ascension of the right hand of the Father.
The counter argument is that Paul the Apostle wasn't there for the resurrection himself, and there's no other reference really, other than I think the 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's only one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at something that we can try to historiographically explain, we look at the various explanations and then we account for the data. So you're correct in the sense that 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once. However, when you corroborate those with the accounts that we find, particularly in Matthew, Luke, and John, I think it does explain, especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended. Even the fact that we have one instance of this being spoken about, and then we can look at the individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then others in the New Testament documents that talk about the resurrection of Jesus, that, even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think we have to explain these particular instances where we don't just have people who are friendly to this happening, but we have individuals who are actually hostile. In James, the brother of Jesus, who the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family was actually very hesitant in how public Jesus' ministry was. Then we have likewise Paul, who started his life as a persecutor, and that has a radical 180 in terms of him then going on and writing the majority of Holy Scripture within the New Testament.
Now, Piers Morgan goes on to give some objections to this, but he does a couple of things really well, I thought. Number one, he listened, which he's not always famous for doing that. But secondly, he also pointed out the importance of the resurrection. I wish Christians thought about this. Like, if this happened, it's game over. I mean, it's the thing is really, really real. And I know kind of the resurrection has been your point of emphasis as much as anything is there anything you would add on, just maybe that he left out up until now that you were
just to work in some of the evidence here? I think, Brett, he's talking about the fact that we're taking this account from multiple sources. Now, he's right that people want to point to the Bible and say, well, that's a religious book, you can't trust that. But anyone working on a bibliographic PhD, where you're going to have to look for sources in history, whether that was 100 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the bottom line is, if you're going to do your PhD right, you want to get the earliest sources you can on an event. In fact, you want to get the primary sources if you can. Well, the New Testament documents are the primary sources for the Christian faith. So far from it being a bad thing for us to go to the Bible to look at this, it's actually the thing that we should do. But I understand people saying, well, I don't want to say the Bible is true because the Bible says this, and how do you know the Bible is because the Bible's true, and get into a circle there. But I would encourage people to remember these facts. I'm going to give you the word facts as an acrostic. F is for fatal. Jesus' wounds on the cross were fatal. We got that that Jesus died there. We got that from Tacitus. And Paula Fredrickson said, that this was one of those things that is known past doubting. I think that was her. It could have been John Dominic Crossan. But the idea is the scholarship today understands this is something that is past doubting. You have to deal with the fact that Jesus died. He also appeared. A is for appeared. He appeared to others after his death. Now, that's not what all the secular scholars scholars will say. But what they will say, someone like Bart Ehrman again, is what they will say is they'll say, the earliest Christians had experiences that at least they interpreted as being the risen Christ.
Right, yeah.
And then that leads us on to see they were committed to the point that they were willing to die for that, and they had a strong testimony that carries on today. But the very idea that that these people were willing to suffer and die for this that they claimed, and that we have multiple sources cross-referencing that, should cause you to raise your eyebrows about this and say, okay, there is some really good evidence around this thing.
Absolutely.
To play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You know, you do have something that's very different than a
I thought that was a great point, by the way. All historical stuff is that's the only thing there is. That's a good one.
courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history in one sense is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, you know, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery.
I'm so glad he brought that up. It was one of my favorite lines in all of literature. Chronological snobbery. It's true. We look back and we think, oh, they're just dumb because they're pre-technology, pre-modern science or what have you, but we assume people are dumb back then.
Yeah, and I think they would look at some of the things we do in modern culture that we think is perfectly fine and think these people are barbarians.
Yeah, exactly. They're not so bright. And that whole thing about the disciples doubting when they're right in front of him, to me, that affirms they still knew reality. They know that dead people don't come back. So that's affirming for me. When I read that kind of thing in the Bible, it always helps me a lot.
You know, just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus' death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things.
Now, I've heard about the apostles being, persecuted as danger, but I had never heard of that back to the scene of the crime thing. Am I just uninformed?
No, I think that's a good point that he makes. And I'm thinking about it too. It's like, yeah, but
what made that one before?
No, I haven't really thought specifically about that. And what I find interesting about it is Peter, as we recall, was the one who denied Christ out of fear, and then yet here he is now back at the scene of the crime.
Right.
And
yeah.
That's really interesting.
So it's critical to understand and see the evidence around the resurrection, because it's true. If the resurrection happened, the whole thing, that's the end of the discussion in many respects. So, but now a kind of a classic objection that I've heard many times, and I'm sure you have as well. Piers Morgan is about to quote Ricky Gervais, and he brings that up. And I loved Wes Huff's answer, and maybe it's one you've used, but I had not heard it before. But maybe you could add on as well.
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right unless there are 3,000 different versions of a supernatural, spiritual being overseeing us all. What do you say to him?
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto, where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in this city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime? Really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but, the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Piers, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
So with the resurrection happening, that would settle the issue. I think the people, modern world, struggle because they're aware of other religions, they're aware of people in their lives that worship other gods and things like that. So first of all, did you like his answer?
I love that answer.
Oh, good. Okay. You could have said.
No, I love it. It's very much what I say. Go on.
What do you say?
Yeah, well, what I want to say about that is, first of all, he's pointing to the evidence. It's like when someone brings this objection, well, there's all these other gods, there's all these other religions. Okay, we're talking about this one has the best evidence for it out of those. And that's the main thing. And then on top of that, the 3 Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those are the 3 that pretty much even purport to offer evidential reasons to believe that they're true, giving you evidence to believe that it's true. And of those 3, I just think that we affirm Judaism as Christians, and then Islam to me is just evidentially bankrupt, in the words of Mike Licona. I think it's just one of the easiest false Christian kind of religions out there to shoot down. And so I put it this way one time about Mormonism. I was talking with an atheist on our YouTube channel at Trinity Radio, and we were talking about, he said, yeah, but the Mormons have their own scripture, and the Mormons have their own apologists, and the Mormons have their own preachers, and they have their temple. And I said, yeah, what it sounds like you're doing to me is like we're in this beautiful mansion on one side of the street, this multi-million-dollar mansion, and then there's a styrofoam mansion across the street, and you're saying, but the mansion across the street has a porch, and it has a basement. Yeah, but it crumbles vessels. It's made out of styrofoam.
Right.
And I think that's what we're looking at. Now, what the fear is, like with non-evidential ones, like Hinduism will say, well, yeah, okay, could well say, well, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead, big deal. Yeah, we're fine with that. He's add him to the list or something. But the problem with that is not only is Christianity evidential, but Jesus was very exclusivistic about the truth of Christianity in that respect. I am the way to the Father. No one comes to the Father but by me.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that in our modern world that I've discovered, that especially getting to travel and see other cultures, and I sympathize with the sentiment that I can't understand why somebody who believes in this could be wrong and all the rest. But you do find across cultures. I've stood in a room literally with over 80 different nationalities represented, and we were all worshiping Jesus at the same time. There were people from Africa and Asia and everywhere. You don't know how much Christianity really goes on, especially under the waterline that CNN's not going to tell you about, Fox isn't going to tell you about. It's out there. People who have Muslim backgrounds, Hindu backgrounds, every kind of background you can think of have become believers. It's not exclusive to European and American white culture. It is something that is very cross-cultural and very worldwide, and you'll find that. And so it's not just an exclusivistic thing in that way. Well, thank you very much for watching, and let's talk about this. So you can go to our Patreon now, and we can have discussions about the resurrection, historicity of that. If you have questions about that, Braxton's great at that kind of thing. And also just this whole question of being in a pluralistic society makes for some good conversation. So check that out. Write down your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And check out Trinity Radio as well. We'll see you next time.